Welcome to Postcards from Palisade, the podcast that brings you a snapshot of the people and places that make this slice of Western Colorado wonderful. I'm Lisa McNamara. I'm talking today with Wendy Videlock. Wendy is a widely published and awarded poet, visual artist, teacher, longtime Grand Valley resident, and the impish poem supplier for Palisade street poetry boxes. Wendy was also recently named Western Slope Poet Laureate by the Telluride Institute's Talking Gourds program. This program honors an outstanding poet or performer who has helped promote the practice of poetry on the Western Slope of Colorado. Its purpose is to support the laureate in continuing the work of poetry in and of the Western Slope, teaching, reading, writing, and building literary community across the region. She'll serve in this role for the next 2 years. Wendy and I chatted about why she doesn't like to tell people she's a poet when she first meets them, her goals for her time as the Western Slope's top poet, why ranchers and barbers have a lot in common with poets, what in the world ekphrasis is, the importance of poets in the community, why poets don't just say what they mean, but why you still shouldn't be intimidated by poetry. We also talked about how East Coast and Western poets are different, maybe not in the ways you might expect, and the place that drew her back to Palisade. And finally, her biggest goal as a poet and why it's so related to where we live. And get this, we have poems for you today too. Wendy brought along a stack of her favorite poems and treated us to a few of them. I'm not sure why I was surprised, but Wendy treating us to a private poetry reading was a bonus that I was not expecting. But as we chatted, the new sound-absorbing panels that I had just installed on the walls of my little office started to fall down at random intervals. It felt kind of poetic, actually. All that and more on today's Postcard from Palisade.
I'm Wendy Videlock. Sometimes when we say, "Hi, I'm a poet," it kind of turns the conversation downward spiraling. So I tend not to say that right away when I meet somebody. I tend to say I'm an artist, which I am. I'm also a visual artist, and people don't have the same response in the general public when you say that you're an artist. So I show work at the galleries here in town, here at the Blue Pig, and Working Artists Gallery in Downtown Junction, Willow Creek, Herbs and Teas, Lithic Bookstore. And then if I'm feeling fairly good about the conversation, I might mention that I'm a writer.
Oh, not even a poet yet.
Again, you're sort of moving into that area. Because the poet has a reputation of, being a navel-gazing, sort of boring individual. And it's kind of my job to change that reputation. A lot of people put their poetry, anti-poetry deflector shields up back in high school. Too much Robert Frost at the age of 14. Robert Frost is great when you're 45, not great when you're 14. So I've always felt it was sort of part of my responsibility to turn people on to the joy of poetry. And, we've got a lot of people who say they don't like poetry, but they turn to poetry when faced with grief, great loss, also great celebration, graduations, partings. When things really matter, we turn to poetry. When they don't matter, we hate it.
I was thinking the way that a lot of people have probably interacted with you around Palisade is the poetry box, which you brought in.
Because it fell. I was walking down the sidewalk and I was going to fill it up. And I saw it was somebody had set it on the bench because they knew that I'd be back to fill her up. And it does empty out like nobody's business. I fill it, it's like, probably 75 to 100 poems each time. Wow. And a week later, it's empty.
Wow.
And I actually have another one over by the little library. Yeah.
So when did you start that?
It's been a couple years. And it empties even when we're not in our tourist season, which is what is really cool, is that locals are walking by and saying, "I think I'll take a poem. It's good medicine."
Oh, I have taken one. Definitely taken one.
What'd you get?
I think I don't remember because it was a while ago and I was trying to find it before I came over here and we moved and I'm not sure where I put it. So I got put in somewhere. But yeah, very anticlimactic response. But I love the idea. And so I think a lot of people, obviously, like you said, you fill it up. It empties regularly, so I think a lot of people have seen you that way. But it looks like you don't just put your poems in there. You also put in other poets.
I don't. I put a few of mine in. I do, and I put a few other regional poets in. But mostly what I do is I put in the kind of poem that if somebody, because there's this little note on the poetry box that says, "For best results, close your eyes while choosing." Because people think, you open up a book of poems and you start from page 1 and you go, and that's just really not how poetry works. It's very much more intuitional. And so you open up a book and there might be a poem in the middle of the collection, and if you start to read and you don't like it, guess what? Turn the page. And then you get to try another one. So it's sort of like a box of chocolates. You get to, there's just something for everybody's taste. So the kind of poems that I like to put in the poetry box, and I'd like to do this in Junction and Fruta too, but it turns out it's very expensive printing poems on paper all the time. But I select the kind of poems that will surprise people. It won't be what they expect to find, and that might have some kind of a meaning. Just kind of like screeing, which is, you take something at random, a tarot card or a I Ching or something like that, and it has meaning simply because you chose it at random.
Absolutely. Yeah, the one on top, I really like that poem.
Oh, you know that? The Mary Oliver.
That's a great one.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, so I was curious if there was any particular type of poem. So if it was your type of poem, or your poem, or anybody else's poem, if there's a particular type. Sometimes
I want to go for something funny because people don't necessarily, poetry can be very bawdy and raunchy. I try not to put too raunchy, but a little bawdy because I don't want anybody to get, upset. Of course, it doesn't have my name on the box, so. But something that's going to, like this Mary Oliver, you sort of go through this little litany of who made this, who made this, I don't know, and then she says, tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? I mean, who's not going to get goosebumps from that? That's going to have meaning if you select it. And it's a contemporary. She died maybe 5 or 10 years ago, but it's a contemporary piece. And then I also put poems that are, from the classic periods and older periods, and then anything that's going to get your attention.
I love it because it's just this. It's like no pressure. Somebody walking by, you're not saying, if you said come up to me and let me give you a poem, it'd be totally different than you approach this box and you take a poem and you take it home.
It's a little different.
It's really cool. Do you ever hear from people who take poems out of that box?
Yeah, I do all the time. People assume that it's me because there aren't a lot of poets in Palisade. There are unexplored poets. When we moved here 30 years ago. But then we moved to Junction and Fruitvale and moved all over the valley and came back to Palisade about 8 or 9 years ago. And when we first moved in, the barber shop, which was right along here next to the Blue Pig, was closing down. He'd been here for a while. And I sat on the bench and spoke with him, and he was a poet. He was a barber. He grew peaches. But what he said was beautiful. So I had to write a sonnet about him. The lost poet at the barber shop, and he was closing down his barber shop that day, so he was feeling philosophical anyway. But I find that ranchers and growers, their relationship with the land gives them a lot in common with the poet. They use idioms, they use particular frames of speech that have to do with the land. They tell the story of the land. That's really what the poet does. Yeah.
So you've obviously done a lot, widely published and awarded, but the big thing that just happened was being named the Poet Laureate for the Western Slope, which is huge. Yeah. What does that mean to you to have
It's pretty awesome.
The honor?
I mean, it's interesting. So they do the state laureate every 4 years, and twice I was the finalist for that. And it was daunting, because they tell you you've been shortlisted, so you've got weeks where you're waiting. And it's very difficult. And I would have really liked to have represented the Western Slope for the whole state. But when this thing came along, I said, you know what, even better, because I get to work where I live, and I get to, try to make a difference here. And also, I know so many poets and writers over on the East Slope that a lot of the programs that I want to implement here, hopefully I can, kind of deputize some of my friends and colleagues over on the East Slope and get them to put some of these programs in place too.
So is it something that you applied to, or are you nominated for?
It was a nomination this year, and then it was voted. So it's done by the Telluride Institute, the Talking Gourds program, which has been around for decades, and Art Good Times, who was the county commissioner of San Miguel County for many, many years. The Grand Poobah of the Mushroom Festival, he's kind of really well known over in these parts. I think he was the first one, I think 12 years ago. And it was a nomination process, and then up until that point. And then for this one, they decided to open it up and let poets vote, which was an honor, that my colleagues voted me in. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Cool.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
So I just picture like a network of poets everywhere just kind of whispering to each other, and everybody being like, Wendy.
Or not Wendy. Anybody but her.
Well, it's such an awesome honor. Is it something you've always aspired to, or?
Not at all. But I'll tell you, as I've grown older, I've begun to realize more and more the importance of my role as the poet within the community, because I've done so many funerals and memorials. People really do turn to the poets. I even had one poet put it in his will that he wanted me at his funeral, and he had money set aside to have me travel there. That's how important it is to people to have, meaningful words spoken. I mean, because we turn to the poets, during these times. I mean, during 9/11, there was such a call for poetry, and a very famous poem by W.H. Auden was making the rounds in a way that I'd never seen a poem do. And it was written many, many years ago, but it felt like it really was relevant to that moment. And it really happens with collective crisis and also personal crisis.
Absolutely.
But also during times of great celebration, inaugurations and graduations and weddings and, things like that.
Right.
We turn to poetry then too.
Just think about how much Amanda Gorman's poem I feel like millions of people read that poem.
Yeah.
It went around and around for weeks.
And it's just been blacklisted in Florida.
Yeah, right.
It's just really...
Yeah.
It's sad.
Well, but no, just to your point about those
about how
times
much there's a hunger and a thirst. And so, I mean, for many years I thought, why am I doing this? And publishing books and, publishing in journals. And, I got published in O Magazine. That was sort of a big deal. And the New York Times. And,
There goes one.
That was cool.
That's what they do. Oh, gosh.
And all of these accomplishments really weren't all that satisfying.
Interesting.
They don't change your life. None of that comes from, the real joy is writing the poem. That's the real joy. The real joy is painting a painting. Not selling it is great, don't get me wrong. And it's lovely when people buy my books and actually read the work. But it's the creative process that is on my mind all the time. And it's the thing that when I teach, I'm always saying, this is something that saves people's lives. This little thing that we can do, which is just called creating. Artists and poets have known this for thousands of years, and so we're always out there going, okay, here's how you do it. And it's not that there's a rule. In fact, there's no rules. What you do is you kind of just get out of the way, and then the creative thing starts to happen. It's like a conversation. You just kind of allow it to happen.
When you write, do you have a process where you are sitting down for a certain amount of time a day and you force yourself to write, or do you just do it when it comes to you?
Yeah, it's interesting. So if I'm not writing poetry, then I have to sit down and just shoulder to the grindstone and get going. With a poem, it's a little different because it's all driven by sound for me, and so I'll get a rhythm and I'll get a line. And it's sort of like getting a song stuck in your head. You've got to start playing with it. And then you start to say it, and then you start to write it, and then you start to sing it, and then And then you wonder, if it's going to go anywhere. And then once you're in, then you're trying to get out, because the ending of a poem is really important too. Yeah. So, as Billy Collins says, all the poet does is trying to get out once they're in. Like, how are you going to, finish this? Like, you had a great start. And so many poems have a great start, and then they don't get there.
Yeah. The ending is absolutely
it's
the one
so
that's
crucial.
Just like,
yeah.
Do you have one that you want to read?
Yeah, I think I'd give you a sample.
Cool.
Okay. This one's called Just So You Know. Just so you know, close to the chest is close to the bone. Just so you know, there's not much growth in your comfort zone. Just so you know, the pen is no mightier than the soul. Just so you know, a guarded heart keeps the lark at bay. Just so you know, the wind carries your words away. Just so you know, your bliss is the sister to your pain. Just so you know, the lotus is married to the mud. Just so you know, to listen deeply is to love. Just so you know, everything is an inside job.
So what you bring me to is writing the poem obviously is important, creating it, but I think so much poetry is enhanced and made alive by the poet reading it and the distinct delivery style that you develop over time.
Yeah.
Do you feel like that's something that has always been the same for you? Or do you think you've developed more of a different delivery style as you've gone through your career?
Well, I taught for many years. So when you're standing in front of kids and high school kids and then university students, you learn a lot of tricks. Because once you start to lose them, you better do something different. You've got to change the rhythm. You've got to move your body in a different way. And it's really the same way on stage with delivering a poem. So I heard this great line recently, which was, anybody on stage who isn't aware that the audience wants to be seen is really missing out on something. And it did take me some years to sort of realize that the audience too is plugging in. Like you've got nothing unless you're connecting with the audience. And that if you're not really looking at the audience and paying attention to where their attention is, then you don't know when to quit. As I always say, always leave them wanting more. If you go on and on, you're just adding to that reputation, that we're trying to sort of revamp, know. And also slowing down, because the whole art of poetry is the art of listening. And most people don't listen very well, particularly if they have something to say. Which is why I want to institute this program whereby we do these sort of invocations. Regional poets, go into like town halls and school board meetings and, places where decisions are being made that affect people across the board. It's like policy making situations, and just deliver a brief invocation, which just invites everybody to slow down, to connect with their humanity, instead of going and going, whoa, I'm going to get what I have to say up there and I'm going to fight for it. Nothing gets accomplished if we go in with that. If we go in with a little bit of a listening attitude, then...
This is going to happen throughout. So the tiles are falling off the wall to anybody listening to this later. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sure it'll just keep happening.
We enjoy, it's a kind of an... it's an emerging form. It's something that you have to let it happen.
Totally. Well, I was really intrigued by that part of your announcement about what your goals were for your 2-year term as a poet laureate, which is a really hard word to say. But
I say lariat.
Oh, okay.
I'm kidding.
Oh gosh, that would just
Lariat.
Like a poet laureate. Yeah. But I thought that was really interesting and intriguing that you wanted to bring poetry to more people and to different types of settings, because in
small amounts. And we've already started. I did a house concert the other day where they invited me to do the invocation. Trish Hopkinson, who is another poet. Do you know Trish?
I do, yeah.
She's going to be doing an event for awareness about human trafficking on June 12th in Grand Junction. So we've already started, and
awesome.
We've got a good collection of regional poets, and we want to extend beyond just the Grand Valley. We want to be in Uray County and Telluride and Ridgeway and Montrose and Crestone and
right, because this is all of the Western Slope.
All of the Western Slope, which is remarkably something like 27 counties. It's really remarkable.
Yeah, huge area.
Yeah.
So how would somebody get, if say they wanted to invite like a local poet or one of you or you even into do a reading at the beginning of a meeting or an event, how would they go about even requesting that?
That's a really good idea. So what I'm going to end up doing is making a website so that people can see what we do. But for now, before we get there, they can reach me by phone, 970-241-2057, or they can email me at Colorado, with an A at the end, Colorado, Wendy, Wendy, @gmail. Yeah.
And I'll put your email for sure in the description of the...
that'd be great. Because I really want Palisade to be a kind of a forerunner. We could do town halls here, and we've already got some events Caleb has been doing with the paddleboard club. So things are starting to happen. Hopefully we'll break through to the library too.
I love that. And I love that idea of starting a meeting, especially a meeting where you're going to be talking about contentious things with a poem, because normally if the public is coming to, say, like a board of trustees meeting or a planning commission meeting, usually they're coming because they're upset about something.
Right.
And
also,
it does feel sometimes sort of like you're just speaking your piece just to do it. I like that idea of kind of opening up with a listening attitude. And it's cool.
And sometimes the poem can be funny. And sometimes just laughing with people brings out your humanity. I mean, there's just nothing like a good hearty laugh.
So I feel like we touched on this a little bit, but why do you want to bring poetry to more people in that sort of a casual format? Casual being everyday, going about your everyday life.
Yeah, that's the question. That is the question. So in my own sort of personal development, I've been working on this thing called integration, which is, there's a part of me that's a visual artist, there's a part of me that's a mom, there's a part of me that's a wife, there's a part of me that's a poet, there's a part of me that's a teacher, and I put on these different hats. And I've always felt that it's all one. It's all the same. And why should I feel this way? It's true in the arts too. The visual artists, they all know each other. They've got their own community. The poets, they have their own community. The sculptors have their own community. And this has always seemed to me a missed opportunity. Many, many campfires, one fire. So it seems to me that poetry in particular is sort of often its own little ghetto. So that people who are interested in poetry go to poetry readings. They're pretty well attended too. They go to readings and novel readings. They go to the library for events, and they're very into that. But why not incorporate? Why not integrate so that, at an art opening, you've got a poet. I talked this morning on CPR about this art form, which is called ekphrasis, because before photography, the only way that people knew about a famous sculpture or monolith or painting was that the poet would write about it, because the language could get passed because it was spoken. We didn't have cameras, so the average person didn't get to see the famous artworks that were, being placed in the big, cities.
Right.
So that's a service, that the poet does, and we do this today. It's called ekphrasis. We go into the galleries, we get a few poets to write about some of the works in the galleries, and then during the opening, the poet, recites a poem that they've worked with, and that's another program I'd like to get going is with the Art on the Corner. As we unveil, have a poet there who's been working with that sculptor, has gone and visited, during the process, watched the process, gotten to put into words, because a lot of times they'll ask the sculptor, they'll shove a microphone in their face, and they're like, they don't, they just spent 5 years of their lives building this thing, but they haven't the language to describe. And the poet comes in and swoops in and reads a poem, and it opens up the language for the sculptor, because now the sculptor has some grounding, that's something, because, the poet has this concept. show, don't tell. We don't say, this is a beautiful piece. We describe it instead of telling you what to think about it. And that gives the sculptor or the artist something to say about their work that they hadn't maybe even noticed.
That's such an interesting idea. And I don't think I've ever experienced an example of that. Which is funny because, my dad's an artist. I grew up going to art museums. I love art. It's like, but I can't think of an example of something like that I've experienced before.
Is your dad a local artist?
No, I grew up in upstate New York.
Oh, so. Really? Yeah. Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Ah, my husband's from Bethpage, Long Island.
Have you done any... now, how do you even spell that?
Ekphrasis.
Ekphrasis.
Ekphrasis. It's from the Greek. If you look it up, you'll see all kinds of famous examples. There might be poems that you've heard of before that you didn't know were actually ekphrastic poems. Yeah. So they were about, Apollo's torso by Rilke. I never saw Apollo's torso, but I knew the poem, and then I went and did more research on the actual piece of art. Because it's never just about the piece of art. It's more, it always gets bigger than that. And one of our more successful literary journals does an ekphrasis every month. They put up a painting, a contemporary painting, and then they do a contest. The poets submit, and then they feature one that is chosen by the artist and one that is chosen by the editors.
Ooh, I like that.
Really interesting, yeah.
Ooh, I love that. Yeah. I gotta check that out. Okay, let me make a note really quick.
So that's called rattle poetry.
Rattle?
Yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
I need to check that out. Just personally, I really like that idea because it would be really cool to see how they compare and contrast, like the one the artist picked and the one the editors pick.
Yeah. Well, editors tend to pick more sort of literary, and then the artist tends to pick something that takes some aspect of their work and then goes off in some other direction. Because that's really what a painting or a poem should do. It's not like a contained thing. It's more like, it's not like you quote capture something. I hate when people say, oh, your poem really captured that. It's like, no, it's supposed to set it free, not keep it still. It should be opened, I mean, I'm a poet, so words.
That is such a cool distinction.
Yeah, I've got one more little poem I'd like to do at this point.
Okay.
This is kind of my my little anthem about poetry. Poetry is not a line in the sand, but a kind of circulation. Not a rare, exotic bird, but a sparrow and a raven. Not a call to commiserate, but a fierce conversation. Not a star in the dark, but the whole constellation.
That kind of ties into one of the things I read about you on your bio on the Poetry Foundation was that, I'm just going to read their quote, but it says, known for poems that evoke myth, fairy tale, and the natural world, Videlock has also received praise for her deft command of meter. And I think that's a great example of that. How would you describe what meter is to somebody who's not a poet and doesn't understand poetry?
Such a great question.
Wouldn't understand that compliment?
Right. Well, this is the best way to describe what we call meter, which just means measure. It's the heartbeat. What does the heart do? Pum, 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 pum. It's the pulse of the sea. What does the sea do? Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. And then it has variations. So it's not like a metronome. There are variations. So Shakespeare really is kind of the founder of what we think of as modern meter. And he was writing very specifically for actors on a stage. And what he did is he didn't call it this. Later on, the critics went back and went, let's call this iambic pentameter because... But what Shakespeare was doing was saying, after a certain amount of breath, the actor needs to take a breath. So we'll stop the line after this certain amount of measurement. And the measurement happened to be 5, what we call beats. So my love is like a red, red rose. My love is like a red, red rose. Goes up and down and up and down. But it doesn't, but when you say it, you don't say my love is like a blah, 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 because that's just the mark of someone who doesn't understand that this is how we speak in normal English. And when you want to really make a point, you're doing it in iambic pentameter. You just don't know that that's the name of it.
Ooh, interesting.
It's really interesting. So it's true of a lot of things in the arts. You'll say, look at how that artist used dark and light together. And you go, well, look at nature. That's how nature did it. So the artist is really just imitating what's already out there, whether it's the heartbeat, the pulse of the rhythm, the forest, the drum of the sound of life. It's just that. So within meter, we have what we call substitutions, so that when you're getting to a really good line, like if you think in a pop song, the best singers have a way of playing with the line so that it becomes really emotionally packed. That's what poetry does with meter, is it has an expectation and then it averts that expectation. People think it means keeping in lockstep. No,
right.
It means creating the rhythm and then averting it.
Otherwise, not everything would sound exactly the same.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
That's the great magic of it. That's a great question.
Poetry can be really intimidating. And I think some of it is because some of the words that are used to describe it, or, even somebody kind of opening a page, you might say, well, this doesn't look familiar to me. I'm not going to continue.
Yeah.
So I think making it relatable.
That's the reason we put up the anti-poetry deflector shields. It makes people feel stupid. And that there's a clue, and that we don't have the key to that. Right. My daughter came home from school in high school, and she said, I hate poetry. Why doesn't the poet just say what they mean?
That's cute.
And it was adorable, because, but the truth is that when we say what we mean, like, oh, I feel sad, nobody's going to get moved.
Right.
I feel sad. Oh, okay. Well, how do we grab onto that and make it our own? And so the poet has a metaphor, and then it comes sneaking up from behind, and that's when it knocks us down. And music is exactly the same way, and the visual arts are exactly the same thing. Once we get surprised, and that, film is really poetic. That a good filmmaker knows how to avert our expectation and make us think we don't know what's going on, and then suddenly we don't have to have a key. We just feel it.
Have you always written poetry, or did you start at some point in your life? Like, what was the first poem you ever wrote? Do you remember how old you were?
I remember the first poem I ever learned by heart, which was probably more meaningful than the first poem I wrote, because that I don't have a memory of. But my mother asked me to learn a poem by heart. I say by heart instead of memorize, because a lot of people don't like this word, memorize. And it was, I met a little elf man once down where the lilies blow. He asked me why I was so small and why I did not grow. I'm just as big for me, I said, as you are big for you. Or I missed a couple lines in there. But it's really about individuality and saying, we don't have to be like everybody else. And it really struck me that this was something that was meaningful to my mother. It wasn't really meaningful to my dad, to be honest. It was meaningful to my mother, and so it had meaning to me. And what I've discovered is that people are hungry for meaning. They've been disappointed by some of the aspects of meaning that we've traditionally relied upon. And so the arts are where a lot of people are turning, and they're discovering that there's a whole lot of glory in there. And a lot of people say that the arts saved their lives, specifically poetry. You're never alone if you're reading poetry. And if you're writing it, then you've got an extra boom, And this doesn't mean you have to publish. Like, a lot of poets don't publish, but they're interested in language, and they're interested in, And then there's the healing aspect, which we use with all kinds of people who've been traumatized and have been through wars and childhood difficulties. And that we learn that there's 3 steps to healing with the arts. So, because we think that it's just, if you paint a picture or you write a poem, boom, that's a healing right there. No, that's step 1. That's the purge, you're getting it out there. Step 2 is crafting it. So now you're creating something beautiful out of something difficult, which is what poets do. I mean, let's face it, life is difficult. We're all going to die. Like, that's the bottom line. You're going to have a lot of suffering in your life. You're also going to have a lot of joy. But the poet won't let you just get away with one or the other. Like, you've got to have it all, right? And so with the crafting, what you're really doing is teaching yourself how to process difficult things by making it more meaningful, more beautiful, more powerful, and also by sharing it. And that's the 3rd step, is actually sharing it. by doing that, now you've really done something. You've shifted the energy. You haven't kept that energy locked inside so that it's now going to create inflammation and heart disease and all kinds of other things that come from emotions that we're just not processing, which is really what we're taught to do, is just move on ahead. Stay busy. Keep consuming and you'll be fine.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Totally. And that makes me think about 2 weeks ago, I talked to Christine Moore, who's the local yoga and dance teacher.
Yeah.
She was talking a lot about how, to her, processing trauma through dance and like movement was so important. And it's a similar thing where it's like, even if you don't necessarily perform, you're doing it for yourself, or, you're teaching somebody and teaching somebody how to, physically, like some people need to let go of their emotions physically, some people need to do it, mentally, or a combination of the two or whatever. And
physically is absolutely, you talk to any poet and they'll tell you that part of their process is moving. Like if they're walking, that's when the best work comes. If they're rowing, bicycling, driving.
Oh yeah.
These kinds of movements, are really important. And she's right. If you are moving, you're actually processing. I think it's the answer to all that ails us.
Totally. Yeah. I definitely have my best ideas when I'm biking or hiking, and you get to that point where your body's doing something but your mind disconnects, and then it's such a cool
you're
feeling.
In the zone.
Yeah.
That's it. That's what we call creative process, and that's the thing. It's all the rest is great, don't get me wrong, I'm happy to have it all, but it's that thing of being in the zone. that's what we're all about.
Do you have a favorite poem of your own that you've written?
Ooh.
Or do you like all of them?
I do have one that I really like. Want me to read it?
Sure.
I originally titled this poem Deconstruction, but I think it needs a better title, but I'm not going to try to revise it
right now.
I'm just going to go ahead and give it to you.
Okay.
And one of the reasons I really like it is because it speaks about birds, and birds are everywhere, and it also speaks to our need to try to put meaning on things, and particularly those of us who are interested in the arts. But if somebody that you love dies and a butterfly lands on your hand, you've just found meaning. And this is what we do with birds and wildlife and nature, and to me this is the magic of the arts. The chickadee is all about truth. The finch is a token. The albatross is always an omen. The kestrel is mental. The lark is luck. The grouse is dance. The goose is quest. The need for speed is given the peregrine, and the dove has been blessed with the feminine. The quail is word and culpability. The crane is the dean of poetry. The swift is the means to agility. The waxwing, mere civility. The sparrow is a nod to working class nobility. The puffin is the brother of laughter and prayer. The starling, the student of Baudelaire. The mockingbird is the sound of redress. The grackle, the uncle of excess. The flicker is rhythm. The ostrich is earth. The bluebird is, yes, a symbol of mirth. The oriole is the fresh start. The magpie, prince of the dark arts. The swallow is home and protection. The vulture, the priest of purification. The heron, a font of self-reflection. The swisher belongs to the fairy realm. Resourcefulness is the cactus wren. The pheasant is sex, the chicken is egg, the eagle is free, the canary, the bringer of ecstasy. The martin is peace. The stork is release. The swan is the mother of cool discretion. The loon is the watery voice of the moon. The owl is the keeper of secrets and grief and fresh fallen snow. And the crow has the bones of the ancestral soul. The other day I read this at that house concert, and a gentleman came up to me afterwards and he said, he showed me his arm, and there was a tattoo of a penguin. He said, "What about the penguin?" And I said, "Well, the penguin, because I am a poet, of course have an answer." I said, "Well, the penguin is about fatherhood. It's the father who rears the baby and takes care of the egg and all of that." And he said, "I did this for my son. He and I both love penguins." And I said, "There you go." So this is what I mean by meaning and, the sort of random.
Yeah, and I like the visual, too, that you get from that, because you are, you take a moment after, or on every line to envision the bird.
Yes, yeah. And also, it's sort of like flowers. Like a red rose means something different from a yellow rose.
Right. That's really cool.
So they're actual real things, but they also are symbols. They represent something in the human psyche. The tower represents something. The river represents something other than, obviously, the river.
Right.
So, yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. I really appreciate you sharing poems as well. What other poets do you like to read?
Oh, my goodness.
Or listen to?
Well, so I love Lucille Clifton, who I actually have a poem of hers that I would like to share. It is hilarious and it's very short.
Okay.
And it is one that I put in the poetry box because it's one that if the wrong person gets it, it will make me happy just to think that might be a possibility.
We should sign it or something, and then it'll be something that somebody can find as part of this podcast.
Well,
but then you don't want to put your name on it, maybe.
Oh, come on. I hope I have it. Oh, there it is. Okay, so this is Lucille Clifton. She was born in 1936 and she died in 2010. And the title of the poem is Wishes for Sons, S-O-N-S, for boys, Wishes for Sons. I wish them cramps. I wish them a strange town in the last tampon. I wish them no 7-Eleven. I wish them 1 week early and wearing a white skirt. I wish them 1 week late. Later, I wish them hot flashes and clots like you wouldn't believe. Let the flashes come when they meet someone special. Let the clots come when they want to. Let them think they have accepted arrogance in the universe. Then bring them to gynecologists not unlike themselves.
That's really
it's funny, but it's so true too. And I have a boy, and Camille Paglia always says, the reason that women are so much more in tune with their own morality is because they bleed every month. Let's be honest. It's a very humbling, real experience. So this is the kind of thing that I put a few of those in my poetry box and wonder secretly, who's going to get that.
Love that. That's so awesome.
So poetry can do this. It can just make us laugh and also go, that's true. That is something that really is fundamentally, something that your men in the world will never understand, no matter how conscientious they are. That it's just a part of it's part of the life of a woman. Mm-hmm. Another poet that I love is Yeats. He's the Irish poet that every contemporary poet has to deal with. I've had dreams about him. He was the guy, probably the best in the English language of this century. Mm-hmm. Auden, Elizabeth Bishop, Sylvia Plath, Edna St. Vincent Millay. There's so many. Mm-hmm. But I think those are my major influences, and also Joni Mitchell and Bob Dylan.
Okay, yeah.
Because with Joni and Bob, they were writing poetry, and they were writing poetry that rhymed. They just weren't doing it the way that Shakespeare did it. They were playing with the rhyme and allowing it, and so it kind of gave me permission to play with language too.
I have to grab a tissue. I'm so sorry.
Oh, you're fine. Was it the Clifton? Did she make you cry?
She did squeeze me on a little tear. But it's funny because it's it's like sort of it's dark humor,
And it's not. I have a son and a daughter, and the difference. As soon as I read that, I went, "That's the difference." That she was 14 and her life changed. My daughter, something like now you've got a different relationship with life. It's just your body now. Like you're aware that your body has this red blood flowing through it. You can't forget it because you're going to be reminded. And then, of course, we have childbirth. But even if you don't have childbirth, you've got that. And it's just the constant reminder. It's what Camille Paglia calls the chthonic. It keeps us to the earth. Yeah.
You've been here in the Grand Valley for, I think you said about 30 years or so.
Yeah.
So you've been living here, working here. What's the poetry community like here compared to other places you've lived and worked before, other places you've visited?
Yeah, so different. Well, first let me say, one of the first poems I wrote 30 years ago was about the big buffalo in downtown Junction by the bank, which is now closing. And it was the first question everybody had when they heard that the big bank, Wells Fargo, was closing. What about, the buffalo, which is actually a bison, but I'm not going to get pedantic about it. But I sat down and I couldn't believe this thing. It was probably had been there maybe 2 or 3 years before. And I was just completely taken by it. Of course, Art on the Corner was already in place. Dave Davis had been working on that for decades. And I wrote this little sonnet about that buffalo and about this new town that I couldn't understand. I was in Tucson, and we were in Europe, and then Vegas, and then here. And it was a culture shock. We didn't have a Barnes & Noble. We didn't have a Home Depot. This was a huge, and I had a 1-year-old and a 2-year-old.
Oh, wow.
And within about 4 years, I was doing a poetry circle at Barnes & Noble because I was working there. And a gentleman came walking in who was Art Goodtimes, who actually was the one who nominated me for this position. And he makes an impression, let's say that. Beard down to here. He's got this big booming voice. And he sat and listened to our very controlled little circle at Barnes & Noble, and then he walked up to me and he said, "You need to get on my mailing list." This email had just begun. It was like a new thing. And I got on his mailing list and discovered that there were poetry conferences happening all over the Western Slope. And that people were coming from all these tiny little towns and would spend 3 or 4 days. Most of us are pretty introverted. I mean, I may seem like I'm comfortable. This is not, I'm a writer, I'm a painter, I'm pretty much, But when I do get social, then I'm like up. And that's true of most artists, that, they want to be in nature or working. And then when they are social, it's like, and then they have to go and recover. So they would have these amazing events, and and I was going, I'm a writer for the page. I was publishing under pseudonyms. I was doing this very privately. So Art Goodtimes, and his teacher was Dolores LaChapelle, who said, find a place, sink your roots in, and make a difference. And it's what he's done, and it's what he teaches all of us. So Rosemary Watola Tromer, Danny Rosen, who owns Lithic Books, Jim Tipton, who used to run the events at the library, a very different community of writers than you'd find in places where it's very academic. Even though we have, people think that I'm academic because I use the meters and things like that. It's really, it's a strange thing. But here, the thing that binds us together is our love of the land. It's the landscape. Whereas if you're in New York, you're not writing about the birds. And if you are, it's just purely a metaphor.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what makes it different.
And how did you end up coming to Palisade after so many other places?
Well, my husband was in the military, and we were done with that. We had kids late. I was 32 when my first came along, and 33 when my second. And we were in Vegas, and I was teaching there, and I did not want my kids in that school district. It was really scary, and we said, let's go to a small town, and let's not make money be the thing that matters. Like, let's just live in a small little house, and I can wait tables, maybe I'll teach, and you can get it. We won't chase the dollar. That's what we told ourselves, and that's what we did. We didn't know anybody here. We came with a few $100s. We came with 2 babies, a dog and a cat, not knowing a soul.
Wow.
And it took a few years. And like I say, I had this little community starting at Barnes & Noble of people who were kind of readerly and writerly types. But it wasn't until that came, which said, hey, we're meeting in Salida, we meet in Telluride, we meet in Cresta, we do these events, and And I go to conferences on the East Coast too. They're very different. They're lovely, but it's not the same because this is all about really the landscape. I mean, there's a lot of social awareness too here, but our number one issue here in the West is always water and the land. So the art reflects it, and it reflects it in our visual art too. Yeah. Whereas you go to New York, it's going to be mostly portraits or, something that's kind of like Picasso-like. Whereas rural America and, Western America, you're going to see a lot more landscape and what I would call impressionistic and, playing with the actual land.
We're here because it's beautiful.
Yeah.
That's why I'm here. What's your favorite thing about the community here in Palisade? Palisade specifically.
Yeah, Palisade is interesting. So the way I describe Palisade is, obviously we're ag, but we're also very art, which is a really interesting mix. So whatever Palisade does, they want to do it well. So if they're going to do a peach, they're going to make the best damn peach you've ever had. If they're going to grow marijuana, they're going to grow the best pot. If they're going to make art, they're going to make good art. And so Palisade has an interest in excellence. And this to me is pretty awesome. And so I was in Junction when I actually started showing work at the Blue Pig, and my husband and I, we both really wanted to come back to Pali. But it wasn't until I started showing at the Pig again that I went, okay, this is an absolute necessity. We've got a real drive now to come back. So as soon as the kids were grown and left home, we just made a beeline back to Palisade. And of course, I mean, look at these beautiful landscapes. I mean, Buzzard's Roost, and my goal really, my biggest goal as a poet would be to rename Garfield. This is a president who never came here. This is a completely arbitrary name.
Ooh, what would you rename it?
Well, the Ute didn't name it a name. They named it for a position. For instance, if you were on a trek and going somewhere, or maybe to the Four Corners for some large event or, something, then you would name a mountain. From what I understand, you would name a mountain by how you would go around it, like go to the left or go to the right or find the water source and do this. And it would have a practical kind of a name. Because I've asked a lot of Ute elders, and that's kind of the basic answer that I'm getting, is that you didn't name that just for the fun of it.
Sure.
Like Western culture came along and said, let's put our flag in it. It was like, this is part of the walk. And so it was practical to say, this is how you get to where you're headed.
It's a landmark.
Yeah, a landmark. Yeah. And Thunder Mountain means a lot more to me than the Grand Mesa, although I think Grand Mesa is pretty lovely too, because it pays homage to Hispanic culture was here before too. So that's fine. But Garfield, it is the number one landmark that people think of when they think of the Grand Valley, and it's the most strange. And then we've got the Lincoln.
Yeah.
What? Lincoln was not here.
Right.
It makes no sense. Yeah.
I know. What I love about it is that you can always see it when you get to a certain point. And so I know as I'm getting closer and closer to it, I'm getting closer and closer to home.
Right.
And that is the coolest thing. And you're right, Garfield doesn't give you that feeling of like, this is where my home is.
I know. I call it the mighty Gar. And what I like about Garfield is it changes color with the sky. It's like water. It's going to reflect what's happening. It changes with. It's an amazing dying mountain. Is really what it is. It's an ancient dying mountain, and it deserves a better name. I just don't know how to go about that because it's pretty hard to change names.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Who owns the name?
Right.
Who decides?
Yeah.
Anything else that I didn't touch on that you really would love to share with the people of Palisade?
Specifically to Palisade, what I'm hoping to do is to create a monthly gathering with an open mic where there's a featured artist who gets up and tells a story or recites poems or whatever, but also but also that open mic, which is such a community builder.
Yeah.
And you'd be amazed what people do when they get up there. It's just astonishing. I'm always just blown away by the quiet talent That, you know, people aren't out there going, look at me, but if you give them a microphone, they're going to get up there and they're going to show you something pretty cool. That's a large part of what my sort of impulse is that I feel that I've had a lot of talk and conversation and interviews over the years. But what I want to do is to put a spotlight on all the others that have been part of this community that are doing these things in the privacy of their own homes. It's like Leadville. There was a poet living in Leadville. He was growing roses. Nobody knew he was a poet. He was a miner. And when he died, they cleaned out his house and they found all these.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. So to sort of, you know, cultivate that garden of poets and writers that aren't necessarily showing in the galleries or publishing books.
And that would be so awesome to have that here in Palisades, so you don't have to, you know, I know Frida does a lot, which is awesome, and there's stuff in Junction, but like to have something here.
I know, the east end of the valley is, I mean, the library is a big untapped opportunity. And the Blue Pig too. Those are my focuses for after I get the word out program happening, then I'm going to go, okay, right here in this little area, that's where it's going to happen.
Well, that's great.
Yeah.
I'm excited.
Thanks so much for having
me.
This was awesome.
Thanks so much for coming and for reaching out.
Yeah.
I really appreciated hearing from you.
Oh, it was great when I heard about, I mean, what a great title, Postcards from Palisades. I just went, you know what? That's someone who's got a poetic kind of sensibility.
Oh, I love alliteration.
It's always, I know, it's all about the sound of because that's what got me. It could have been podcast from the East Valley or something, and I would have gone, no, thank you. But Postcards from Palisade, I'm in.
Awesome. Oh, I love it. That's like the best compliment.
Do you write?
I've ever gotten. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Sorry, I'm going to stop this so it's not on the record. I mean, what a dork. I was so not prepared to talk to Wendy about my writing. Because even though I do this podcast, I talk to you a little bit here and there. I really am most comfortable listening. I really enjoyed my conversation with Wendy and all the ideas it sparked. I have more great episodes coming up, but I'm probably going to be reducing the frequency that I publish them to every other week, because I got a full-time job, partly to afford more soundproofing for my little office. Haha. If there's any old episodes you've missed, you can catch up on them in the meantime, but I've got a bunch more great stuff coming out in the next months, and we're not going to stop. If you'd like to be on the podcast, or you have an idea for an upcoming episode, I'd love to hear from you. I love hearing from the people that reach out to me. You can reach me at lisa@postcardsfrompalisade.com. The Postcards from Palisade podcast is available on all major podcast distribution platforms. Find it and subscribe now so you never miss an episode. Latest episodes and links to more information are also posted on the website, postcardsfrompalisade.com. Thanks for listening. With love from Palisade.